So our index.html already has a link out to app.js. So let's start editing that. You may remember to change to another file, we can use that Command P shortcut, Control P on Windows, and just start typing the name, app, there it is, app.js. Beautiful. So this business is just some foundation initialization. That $sign function, that's the jQuery function. We're not going to use it ourselves, but Foundation uses it. Let's go ahead and organize all our code inside an object with methods, like we did at the end of yesterday. Const mega roster equals object literal. Now, right when this thing starts out, we want to add an event listener for this form. So let's write an init function like we did yesterday. Now we could say init colon function like this, but we learned that we can shorten that to just init parentheses, and it does the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and put my comma here so I don't forget to put it there when I add another function. Let's not forget to actually run this method. So I will write mega roster dot init to make sure it runs. And what's it going to do? It's going to add an event listener to the form so that it does something when we submit. So we need to grab the form, don't we? We know that document.querySelector can find things. Now our selector could be just form. It's the only form on the page. But if we want this thing to be reusable at all, and we want to make this app maybe a little more interesting, it wouldn't hurt to make that form a little more identifiable. So let's do that. Let's go back to our HTML. And on the form, let's give it an ID. And let's call it new-student. As a general rule, we give our IDs and classes in HTML names with dashes in them instead of camel case or something like that. It doesn't really matter as long as you remember what you did. But since CSS tends to use dashes, we use that in our class names. You'll notice that's what Foundation does as well. Other frameworks like Bootstrap do the same thing, so we're going to do that. So we could say form hash new student. Or we could just say hash new student, right? Either way, that should get us our form. Then we want to add an event listener to that. Now we could save this form to a variable and then say that variable.add event listener, or we can just chain it on the end here. Add event listener. Now once again, we're going to end up with a line that's pretty darn long, especially once we actually finish writing that add event listener call. So here's a handy thing you can do in JavaScript. You can actually put a line break before the dot. Because when a line begins with a dot in JavaScript, it knows, aha, this is a continuation of the line before. You can also put it after the dot, but that's not how people typically do that. So I, again, indented it so I could tell that it was chained onto the one above it. If you're going to do this, go ahead and line up all of your function calls for that line. Indent them all one level down there. So again, just a little easier to read. So add event listener takes two arguments. The first is what event we're listening for. In this case, submit. Other examples, click, mouse over, mouse out, key press. There are all kinds of events. You can look up the documentation to see what all you can do. Submit is the event we're listening for on this element, new student. And we want to call some function when that happens. We could make an anonymous function right here. We've learned how to do that. Or we could give it the name of a function. I'm going to say this dot add student. Notice, of course, I did not put open close parens there. That would actually execute add student and take the return value and set that return value as the event handler, and that's almost certainly not what we want. We are passing around the actual this add student method as the argument, as the callback. We're throwing it around like any other object. So it's a reference to add student. Now, add student doesn't actually exist, does it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't written it yet. So I think I used this analogy with the morning, but not you guys yesterday. I always say it sooner or later. Have you ever heard the expression, dress for the job you want, not the job you have? I think I said that in the morning. I did in here? Okay. So they've never heard it. Well, anyway, we're writing for the function we have. I mean, the function we want, not the function we have. So, add student. Now it exists. I'm going to put my comma there so I don't forget it later. Because remember, this is just another property of this object. It's the same as if we'd written add student colon function. But we didn't. Now we know that since this is an event handler, it's going to be passed that event object as an argument. What else do we know about that? Since this is a form submission, we have to stop it from actually submitting the form so we can handle it ourselves. So the first thing we're going to do in here is event.preventDefault. If we didn't do that, the page would just refresh and none of the rest of our code would run. Now let's try grabbing the student name from the form. So we can say const student name equals event.target.studentName.value. What is event.target? It's the form, right? It's the object on which the event occurred. In this case, it was a form submission, so it's the form. And the form will have a property for every named element in it. So student name. Now ev.target.studentName would give us the actual input, not what we typed into it. So we have to call .value on that to get what we actually typed. So now student name will hold that. We could have also said this.studentName, because this is also the form. Why isn't it mega roster? Up here, this was mega roster, right? That's because this was just a method that we called this way. But since add student is an event handler, this automatically gets set to the same thing as event target. Still, I'd rather use event target because this can sometimes get bound to something else. And in fact, later we're going to do just that. How can I be sure I got it? For right now, let's just console log it. Console log student name, just to make sure we have everything wired up right so far. Let's switch over to our console, refresh the page, type something. There we go. It worked. Type something else. It works. Great. Even though it doesn't really do anything yet, we did quite a bit of wiring things up here, so I'm going to go ahead and make a commit. Here are my changes. What did I change in the HTML since last time? I don't remember changing anything. I do, but I want to show you this. So you can see the diff. In other words, what changed since the previous commit? Let's click on that, and it'll open another tab, index.html working tree, and you'll see side by side with the original HTML, this line was replaced with this line. So I added the ID to new student. Scroll through, looks like that was the only change I made to this file since my previous commit. But if you were kind of surprised to see that file because we didn't do much of the HTML this time, this reminds us what we actually did. We added the ID so that we could use it to grab the form in our JavaScript. So what do we do here? We set up our submit handler for the form. Set up submit handler for the form. We could say for the new student form if you wanted to be a little more explicit. Very good. Let's push it out to GitHub. Great. So we'll take a break, and then we'll work on actually doing something when we submit the form.